Hi, welcome back to woodwinds.com. And today we're going to approach a subject that's very relevant to all doublers, especially young doublers who are currently enrolled in university programs, those who are thinking about it, and even those who have graduated and are trying to find their way in the music industry. I'm joined today by three wonderful multi-woodwind instrumentalists who've also distinguished themselves as university professors throughout the years. And in specific, John Cipolla, who's been now 21 years as professor at Western Kentucky University, Greg Tardy, who's been 14 years now at University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and Gary Whitman, who has recently retired, but was a longtime professor, I believe somewhere around 30 years, Gary, at Texas Christian University. And so we're very lucky today to be able to get input from these gentlemen who have worked in all facets of the industry and are teaching in different sectors of the U.S. So we can get a sort of a roundtable. I'm sort of retired now for 10 years, but I taught for 24 years at a college in New Jersey called New Jersey City University. So hopefully we can all sort of put our minds to trying to give some advice and help, and maybe even some suggestions to young players to how to negotiate the music industry today, which is changing rapidly, perhaps more so today than ever before. So the first question I have to ask of all of you is just a basic question: is how did each of you get started in music, and what was your first instrument? So let's start with John, and then we'll go down to Gary, and then Greg.
Ed, thanks again for having me on. This is quite a privilege to be with these illustrious people and yourself. It's great. I grew up in New Jersey, in Edison, New Jersey, and I got started with a public school music program in fifth grade. And I started on the flute, and I got teased by a lot of my classmates. So I switched in sixth grade to the saxophone. And then my middle school teacher, they called it junior high there, in seventh grade, was a very enthusiastic woodwind player. He would carry his flute to school every day and practice his lunch hour. And he played the saxophone, and he played a lot of local shows. And once in a blue moon, he'd go to New York and play some sort of doubling gig. So from an early age, I got introduced to the idea of playing multiple woodwinds. And then I think even by the end of the seventh grade, I knew that was what I wanted to do without really knowing it. It's all I wanted to really spend my time on. And then to quickly fast forward, I got a very good teacher in New Jersey also in around 15 years old who taught me classical saxophone. And I practiced many hours a day. And then from that point, once I entered college, and I'll just make this brief here, that's when I got introduced at Juilliard to a lot of the New York scene and seeing woodwind players playing multiple instruments. So I just, without even thinking about it, bought a clarinet and started to practice that. And then there's lots more after that, but that's my start, is just viewing it as multiple instruments. My saxophone, though, I would say was my first primary instrument.
Interesting. I didn't know you grew up in Edison. I used to play golf there, John. Not a 9-hole course that always tormented me. But anyway, beside that, Gary, where did you grow up, and what was your start in the music industry?
Well, many thanks, Ed, for having me on. This is a real privilege to all speak with you as well as these fine colleagues. I was born and raised in Texas. And like John, I grew up in the public school programs in sixth grade, and I started on the clarinet. And the only reason I started on the clarinet, my mother encouraged me to be in the band. I think because no one in our family really came from a music background. And she encouraged that. Also, the leadership that comes with being in an organization like that, she thought that would be very critical as far as developing character and leadership and respect, and honoring a group and a commitment that you had to do. So, funny thing, I started on the clarinet because she loved the Lawrence Welk show. And she would see all the clarinet soloist, everyone from Pete Fountain to everyone that appeared on that show. So she thought, wow, what a treat this would be. And then between my 7th and 8th grade year, I was going on 14 years old. Uh, my high school band director, Jim Harwell, who was a great influence, said, we might need some saxophone players in the at that time it was called stage band instead of jazz band. And so that summer I started saxophone, and he was my saxophone teacher. He was a tuba player, but a fine jazz pianist. Loved the big bands. So that's how I accumulated that. And then by my senior year, I had begun flute, actually by 11th grade. So I was clarinet, saxophone, and flute, clarinet always being the central instrument. I began studying with a very influential beginning teacher named Tim Bell, who's a product of the North Texas 1 o'clock program. In fact, he's on Lab 67, if you care to listen to it. But he was very good friends with Leon Breeden and a real exponent of jazz education. But he always told me, you need to practice the clarinet first. Then we would get to the other things. And so that it went from there.
Yeah. All right. We're going to get back to the that aspect of the clarinet first shortly. But Greg, your story now.
I'm from New Orleans. I'm originally from New Orleans. Both of my parents were opera singers. And so I grew up around the opera. And since I was the youngest child and my older sister played flute, and my brother played the trumpet, then it was just natural that I would do some kind of music. And one day my mother brought me home a clarinet, and which was a really beautiful day. And it was just something that I never, I didn't have a lot of teachers when I was coming up, but it's something I just always liked to do. I like to play the clarinet. And then when I, about maybe halfway through high school, I finally had a private teacher, a woman named Carol Tilbury. But going back a couple of years before that, in middle school, I had this band director, and Roger McAfee, and we had kind of a smaller band program, and they had a jazz ensemble, and there were short saxophones for this one concert. And so it was, at one point he came up to me, gave me a saxophone and a fingering chart and a big, in the big band part, and he basically pointed me to a practice room and said, learn it. And so basically I went into the room, I learned this part, and I went in, and at the, it was a last minute thing. So I don't even know if I rehearsed with them, and went in and I played this part on this concert. And then I thought that was going to be the end of it. I thought that was kind of fun. But then after that, then it became a similar thing when I was in high school, where I would play with their jazz ensemble. More in my freshman year, play with their jazz ensemble, played the saxophone a little bit, and it was just something I just looked at as something for fun. And when I went into college, it was the same thing again. I was in a small school called Carroll College. I was studying to be a classical clarinetist. I wanted to be a symphony clarinetist. That was my goal. And but my band director, well, first I joined their jazz ensemble just for something to do, and our band director recommended me for a polka band of all things, right?
and you're still in music.
So I played, I looked at it as a summer way to make money. So I went and I played with this polka band. At the time I was living in Milwaukee, had moved to Milwaukee, and we go around County Stadium playing for tailgate parties. And I go and watch a Milwaukee's Brewers game, the second half of the Brewers game. That was kind of part of the pay. And so then after that was done, I thought, okay, that was nice. And I was going to go back to doing what I was doing. But then all of a sudden I got recommended for this jazz fusion band called Le Crew. And so I started playing with this jazz fusion band on the saxophone. And at this point, I'm playing in front of people. And I figured, well, if I'm going to be playing this in front of people, I better get good at this. And so I just started practicing it more. And at a certain point, my brother would get on me because at that point he was playing jazz, and he kept on saying, "You need to get off of that. You need to check out some jazz." And so I'm like, well, eventually he turned me on to John Coltrane. And when I heard John Coltrane, I'm just like, wow, I don't know what he's doing, but I want to do that. So I initially I dropped out of school because I was going to do a catch-up year where I was going to try to get my saxophone level up to where my clarinet was at the time. And then as it went on, then I started to see all these great musicians coming out of New Orleans. That was the Young Lion period in jazz. And since I'm originally from New Orleans, I just thought, well, had I not left, maybe I would have been a part of that. So I decided to move back down there, and I was going to study with Ellis Marsalis and Victor Goines, but it didn't work out for financial reasons. And so as a result, I wound up just hanging out with a lot of the musicians down there and playing on the street. Then I got recommended for the Elvin Jones Jazz Machine.
That's a pretty big transition.
Exactly. I go from playing on the street in New Orleans and I was playing in second line groups and all that. But then I started touring all over the world with the great Elvin Jones. And then from there, then I moved to New York City. And that's kind of how all that happened. And
well, that's an incredible story, Greg. that I think that warrants a book. Who were your initial musical heroes on each of your respective instruments? On the main category of instruments, saxophone, clarinet, and flute. I know, Gary, you also play oboe, English horn. So who were the people that really stood out as being significant role models for you in the way they played on those instruments? So we'll do it in the same order. John?
Well, I think on saxophone, I used to go to the local library and just pick records out and sign them out from the library. And whatever their stock was of records, I would always go to the classical section and the jazz section. And I guess because of the instruments I played categorically, I would look for saxophone recordings and clarinet recordings, later on flute recordings. So Jimmy Abato was one of the first people that I started to notice. He had a very famous recording of the Glazunov and Ibert concertos. And then Marcel Mule. And then later on, I ended up playing, we were playing a city, well, it was a recording of On the Town with, I think was St. Luke's Orchestra. It was a huge recording project. And then we did 2 weeks at City Opera. And so when we were in City Opera and back the stage, just kind of putting our cases in and just waiting to go for their first rehearsal, there was a guy, an older guy in the back who was kind of sitting there fiddling around. And I think he was playing cards actually. And we ended up playing, and that was Jimmy Abato. And so I got a chance to play for 2 weeks with him. And he was, I guess you'd call him my hero. I just didn't think anything of when I was, making a connection with a human being and seeing a name on a record and the sounds. But I was kind of awestruck. One of the other clarinet players told me a story about him, that they were playing an opera at City Opera some time ago, and the opera was a contemporary opera, and the musicians in the orchestra did not really like it so much, the style of the opera, and it's a difficult music, and it wasn't as pleasing to play. And all of a sudden, out of the back of the orchestra came this stunningly beautiful alto saxophone solo. And one of the other players on the break said, Jimmy, how did you, muster up the focus to play so beautifully amongst all this chaos, I guess, is what they kind of viewed it as. And he said, my job is to do as best as I can to bring the music, to make it as beautiful as I can, and just, project that to the audience and do what the conductor wants. And I think, so Jimmy Abato was a hero in a way, because he made the first connection for me without thinking about it, which, Ed, your book makes really clear. And I think a lot of your interviews, the focus of them is the vocation of performing and earning a living, but also the artistry of what we're trying to do, keeping our level of artistry high and always striving to improve ourselves and study and practice and be the best we can, having those heroes to strive for. But at the same time, we're in a profession that earns money and we have to put food on the table. And he was the first one that I saw that was kind of that combination of that. He was a bass clarinetist at the Met, freelance all over New York City. So that would be one person. And Marcel Mule, French, super virtuoso from a different era. And on this clarinet, probably early on were people like Stanley Drucker, New York musicians. Later on, though, I would fast forward to clarinetists that I kind of met, or mostly have met. Eddie Daniels, of course, would be one of the famous ones from New York City. People just earlier, Phil Bodner, and some of the doublers who I just heard clarinet playing that was like their primary instrument, but just an amazing musical sound and style. Karl Leister from Germany. And then as I fast forward, I actually can say that I still look for my heroes. I have a number of Italian friends, Corrado Giuffretti and Paolo Beltramini, fantastic world-class classical clarinetists that I just try to learn from continually. And flute, it was always, for a long, long time, Jean-Pierre Rampal. And that was real. I just had stacks and stacks of his recordings when I started to take up the flute.
Gary, who are your heroes as you evolved as a professional musician?
Oh, I think there were many on the different instruments. I mentioned that I started clarinet and saxophone with Tim Bell, but the first record he had me get was one called Cannonball and Coltrane.
Oh, that was your first, huh? Wow.
Yeah. And then he really wanted me to study the classical side of saxophone. So like John, he exposed me to Jimmy Abato's recording of the Glazunov, first thing. And it's still one of my favorite recordings today, although there are many great recordings of that standard piece of repertoire. But Jimmy Abato, Al Galladora was, wow. I heard him and just went, oh my gosh, this is what is possible with the instruments, clarinet, I went to North Texas and studied with Lee Gibson, who was very heavily involved with the ICA. That's how I started going to Clarinet Fest in Denver in the 1970s. Right. And heard Guy Depleux, and a live recording by Harold Wright.
Yes, that's posted on YouTube now,
Utterly amazing.
where he plays the boats of Bucolic.
Oh, yes.
I know that very well, man. Whew, say no more.
Live, live from Denver,
Yep.
getting beads to work at a mile high, and it's effortless clarinet playing.
That's 1970, the summer before he became the principal clarinet in the Boston Symphony. So
Yeah.
I'm in total admiration and love with that period of Harold, of all
And-
periods of Harold, but that particular, yeah.
Yes, and later after my graduate school days, I studied with Andy Crisanti, who later became my colleague in the Fort Worth Symphony. He was principal clarinet. I was third and bass, primarily bass. And Andy became more than just a teacher. He became a mentor and a friend and a colleague. But he played with Harold Wright at Marlborough
Yes.
and Don Montanaro and all these clarinet players that he turned me on to, and it changed everything. I was privileged enough to be accepted to play in the Robert Marcellus master classes in the summers of 1979, 1980. And of course, I would buy every Cleveland orchestra recording with George Sell. In Denton, there was a record store called Sound Warehouse. And I would just spend hours in there combing through to find recordings. And by and large, most of those now are on YouTube.
Yes.
And it's great, including Marcellus's recording of the Debussy Rhapsody,
Yes.
which is
But I do want to just mention this for the younger players. And yes, they are so lucky to have so much of the stuff that we had to go searching for, didn't even know existed, available on YouTube for free. However, the resultant sound that comes through your computer or headphones does not in any way give the true depth and beauty of expression that you can get on a fine stereo system with excellent equipment. So that I honestly think that if you're really serious about wanting to really study your heroes, investing in a great stereo system, and yes, they can break your bank, but but just hearing it on a good stereo system, and if you should have a wonderful LP player, there's not anything that is quite like that, because you get a truer understanding of the depth of sound, of the overtone presence, of the largesse of those heroes. So if you find someone on YouTube that really knocks you out, if you have a great CD system or even an LP system, I think you really get a better representation of them. Of course, nothing equals the live performances, but I do think I just wanted to say that because I really think that's not often said enough.
Oh, I think so. And when I was working with Andy, he exposed me to Ralph McLean, who from the Philadelphia Orchestra days, who was Harold Wright's teacher at Curtis. And wow, McLean's recording of the Pines of Rome, it's just it's liquid. It's just like there's nothing like it. So flute, I listened to a lot of James Galway, Jean-Pierre Rampal, as like John said, yes, but for some reason Galway's sound really captured me. And I studied with the third flute piccolo player in the symphony, who I sat behind for 25 years. And she exposed me to a lot of players, and also and was very helpful in getting equipment, which I think is important.
Yeah. Yes.
So and it went from there. Oboe and English horn was a different thing. I would listen to John Mack, and his section in the Cleveland Orchestra.
Greg, you have a different background, I know, in studying, but who were your great influences as you evolved from wanting to be an orchestral clarinet player to a jazz saxophonist, on and so forth?
Yeah, in the beginning, I'd say that Jack Breimer, I ran across a recording of a Mozart clarinet concerto with him, and I would listen to that incessantly. And then from there, a lot of my early my clarinet teachers, it was a woman named Carol Tilbury, and then eventually in college, I studied first with Russell Dagan, who was the principal of the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, and then Jack Snavely over at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And they're both, all three of them are tremendous players, and they were inspirational to me. And then after that, I'd listen to different recordings. I was really into Richard Stoltzman and Stanley Drucker and Larry Combs. I was really, really into them. And as far as early jazz influence, being in New Orleans, I used to hear Pete Fountain just come on TV, and I loved his playing. I'd always run across, over the years, recordings of Benny Goodman, and then Eddie Daniels really blew my mind when I first heard him. And then, years later, then I started checking out more the, Sidney Bechet and Alvin Baptiste and Buddy DeFranco and people like that. And that's, but it's that's kind of how, and then on today, Don Byron and many others of today that really inspire me, and including there's a new person named Virginia McDonald from Canada who sounds great. People don't know about her yet, but she sounds tremendous. As far as the saxophone goes, it was Grover Washington Jr. in the beginning. I loved Grover Washington Jr. My parents used to listen to him all the time. And I had a friend of mine lent me his saxophone, and I used to jam along with those records sometimes. And it was great to finally meet him, and he was just a really tremendous person. And then when I was in my jazz fusion band, then I was checking out, of course, Grover and David Sanborn, Gerald Albright, Ernie Watts, Mike Brecker eventually. And then I got turned on the train, and then that sent me to the whole straight ahead thing. Then was John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Sonny Stitt, Sonny Rollins, blah, blah, blah. I can go on and on. And so as far as the flute goes, back when I was in high school, my sister, who was a flautist, she used to listen to that Too Sweet series with Jean-Pierre Rampal.
Oh, the Claude Bowling Suite.
Yeah. And she used to listen to that incessantly, and I really got that in my head. And then later on, I was exposed to Hubert Laws, and then when I was in Elvin's band, there was this tremendous flautist that was in that band along with me. His name was Kent Jordan. Kent Jordan. He's tremendous. A lot of people don't know about him, but he's ridiculous. And so he was really inspiring to me. So,
yeah. Well, it's amazing hearing all of you talk about the influences, and certainly my heroes were all mentioned there. I mean, the records I had growing up were basically Benny Goodman, the Benny Goodman Story, The World of Stan Getz. And I think I remember some early Pete Fountain records. So Benny Goodman principally was the clarinet influence early on. Even hearing him play the Mozart Clarinet Concerto with the Boston Symphony, Charles Munch conducting. I remember that record. Alto was Johnny Hodges right from the beginning. I just loved him, and I still love him 60 years later. I'm in love with Johnny Hodges' expression and his beauty. Bird didn't come till later in college, and then when that came, well, it's never changed. Bird is still my favorite saxophone player, any style, anytime. I still think he's the greatest genius on the instrument that I ever encountered. listening was. But I did have the opportunity. I didn't hear Train live, unfortunately. When he passed, I was still unaware of him. But I certainly heard Sonny Rollins a number of times. And hearing him in 1972 at the Village Vanguard with Albert Daly, Larry Ridley, and David Lee, that quartet, I've never forgotten that. And I believe unbelievably, someone did record one of the nights there. They were there for 2 weeks, and there's a 2-hour recording up on YouTube that you can access if you Google those names. And Sonny, it is one of his peaks. It was great. I saw Sonny sit an awful lot, Phil Woods. And today, my friend is, he's been a longtime friend, but he was also one of my heroes, Charles McPherson. So on saxophone, that's where it went. After Benny Goodman, I, like John, went to the Lincoln Center Library a lot and got LPs out. And I got this record of Stanley Drucker, who was the principal clarinet in New York Philharmonic, the hometown hero, and hearing him play the Nielsen Concerto, I was like, oh my goodness. How is this possible that someone can articulate like this and have control? And 60 years later, I'm still wondering. But Stanley Drucker, in the classical orchestral sense, was my first hero. Later, the guy who really turned me around and still to this day is my hero on clarinet in the classical world is Harold Wright. And as I studied with Joe Allard around 19 years old, 18, 19 years old, I learned about Eddie Daniels. And then I went to study with Eddie. And I took, my first lesson was jazz clarinet. And boy, that was revealing how little I knew. But Eddie was a sort of a model because the fact that he was so great on saxophone, so great on clarinet. And at that time, he was really working hard on flute. So that idea of being an incredibly well-rounded doubler, he was sort of the first one I met who really had control on all those instruments and was, he's just so aggressive and on top of all of that and practicing 8-9 hours a day. And flute, when I got to study with Tom Neifinger, Ron Powell was everything. And my teacher was everything too. I fortunately had, in my early years of studying with this giant whose picture is behind me in the middle on the wall there. That's Tom Neifinger. And, to study with one of the world's great flute players and great teachers, I was just blessed. And like everyone else in the early 80s, Jimmy Galway's recordings captivated me. Not so much anymore, but they did at the time. But Ron Powell still remains, and William Bennett also remains as one of my real heroes in the flute world. But it's important, I think, to note that, all these influences, varying influences, different styles of music, different instruments, I'm sure you all would agree that to this day, it's still inspiring to have heroes and to recognize people who are so accomplished and to be able to access them and listen to them for an inspiration at any moment is just a joy. And I think the younger players today have the benefit of YouTube, where you don't have to go find a record store and see if they have, a particular recording. Like you can just put in the concerto and put in your favorite player's name, and if it's been recorded, it's generally up there. And it's a wonderful way to inspire one on your instruments. Now, let's get down to the aspects of your teaching. How did each of you come about, to become a university professor? What were the factors that led you to that area of work in the industry, in addition to your playing? Let's go in reverse order this time. Let's start with Greg. Okay.
Well, it was, it's kind of ironic that I would be a university professor, because that was one of the things I swore I would never do. Because back in the beginning, I was always the common thing I would hear, like those who can't do teach what not to do.
Right, of course.
And so then I just thought, well, I don't want to. Of course, that thing is definitely not the case. I don't think it was the case in those days, and definitely it's not the case today. Everyone's climbing over each other to try to get these jobs. So it's But that's the way I thought back then. But you know, I'd say I've been teaching since I was in college. I would have high school students, and then once I moved to New York City, I had to up my game a lot because I was getting a lot of students from around town, people that would hear me play, or I get them through the new school sometimes, and some of these players would be very high level, and because of the way that I learned to play, there were a lot of you know, since I didn't really um, uh, gain my saxophone knowledge and my jazz knowledge direct, like it was a lot of it. I'd say a good deal of it was self-taught. Then I had to basically figure out how can I take all that information and be able to package it in such a way that I can teach it to other people. And so by the time I got to the University of Tennessee, I felt a little bit more comfortable with it. And then over the last 14 years, I feel very comfortable with it now. So that's kind of how the teaching thing came.
Well, you know, the truth is, no matter how many degrees one has or how much practice one has in preparing to teach at a university or college, meaning private students or adjunct work or teaching in a high school, etc., beforehand, ultimately, there's no substitute for actually being on the job and learning as you go along. Joe Allard used to tell me to teach is to learn. And I think that motto is really important because for me, I felt when I got into my teaching gig, I was about 40 years old at the university, but I had taught from probably 20 years privately. I taught from 5th grade through high school at various points. And then when I got to the college, I realized, man, I've got so much to learn. I mean, and I had a bachelor's and a master's in music ed. That was all very nice and good, but learning on the job and trying to be honest with yourself, analytical, and realizing what you have to do. I think I learned more in the years I taught at the university than my students did because I had to. There was no choice. I mean, I had to learn how to solve their problems. And I think I learned more about Joe Allard's things that he was teaching me by trying to teach the students. I had to find a way to say it, demonstrate it, and it really clarified things. So I understand what you're saying, Greg. It really strikes home for me as well.
Yeah, that's definitely the thing. My observations exactly that. I felt that the more that I learned how to teach different things, then the more that I felt like, wow, now that I look at it that way, I can actually take this a lot further in my own playing than what I was doing before, because I actually have a clearer understanding of it now that I had to figure out how to explain it to people.
Yes, it's amazing how that makes us rethink things and look at things from a different perspective. And Joe Allard saying to teach is to learn is so true for any discipline, but to teach with an open mind that you don't have all the answers. That's also, I think, a key to it. Gary, how did you come to your university position?
Well, it was interesting. I was very fortunate. I was a graduate teaching assistant in North Texas, and it was great for me because one year I taught saxophone and woodwind technique class for the music education majors to learn the other instruments, and then the next year it was clarinet and woodwind techniques. But here, the funny thing, teaching a woodwind techniques class, I had never taken the class because I studied all the instruments privately.
Yeah.
So that was a different type of skill, learning how you had to really break it down, go slow. But it was a very important class. Even at TCU for 31 years, I taught the woodwind techniques class. Our department chairman and later our director was adamant about having faculty teach it. It was so important to train music educators. So then I was fortunate when I finished my master's, I taught for 3 years in a north suburb of Dallas called Plano, Texas, which was growing at the time. It was blowing up. People were moving to the suburbs. And I was a woodwind specialist for the school district. It was a very unusual position. And that, well, I did private lessons, but also master classes, and assisting the band programs. And it made on clarinet, saxophone, and double reeds. And boy, it really made you, like you said, you had to focus, on how to solve these problems. What am I going to do this week? How am I going to make this better?
Right.
And then from there, I always felt like I would teach at that was my goal, to teach at a university level. But I got sidetracked a little bit in the 80s being a theater musician, which I was lucky.
Yeah, that can sidetrack you.
And boy, it was great. There were regional theaters in Dallas, Fort Worth, as well as one that I played at every summer, Casa Manana. It's like I was on, quote, staff. We would work 12 weeks out of the summer, 6 nights a week. 6 to 7 different musicals, and it was great training. And then when I won the position at TCU and started at TCU, it was 1989, and they wanted someone that was multi-woodwind at the time. It was growing from a department of music into a school of music. So I started out teaching clarinet as the main thing, saxophone and oboe. And gradually I reduced that, and my load grew quite a bit to just clarinet and chamber music. And of course, playing with the orchestra. But it evolved in gradually over time.
Interesting. And John, I know a little bit, obviously, because knew you from New York and how you went about going to get your doctorate, and you definitely wanted a university position. So how did that all come about for you, working in New York, doing shows, gigs? How did that desire to move towards the university position evolve for you?
I had decided after my 2 daughters were born to maybe just go back to school and get this degree and try to go get a college teaching job and just rechart things. So again, Cats and that closing of that show kind of just changed the course for me. Again, though, I still had the idea that I probably would move back to New York and I would just pick up, but maybe just refocus my energies on different projects and not so much on being 6 nights a week in an orchestra pit on Broadway. Well, I went and got the degree in North Carolina in Greensboro. One of my former friends from Eastman School of Music, Dr. Kelly Burke, was a year ahead of me at Eastman, and she was a clarinet professor there. And I was actually giving a presentation at a clarinet association about one of the Carl Behrman recordings I had made. I had made some educational recordings for Music -1 at that point. And she said in that, I think it was in Ohio that year, she came from the audience and she said, you should teach college, you'd be good at it. And I said, well, I have 2 young children, I'm playing all these gigs, I can't leave, I'm kind of like cemented there. And so anyway, 2 or 3 years later is when the notice went up for Cats for the 3rd or 4th time. And I said, maybe I'll go down. So I think around March or April, I flew down to North Carolina and she showed me the school. I did an audition. I went through the whole formal process, but it was very late. But she got me arranged with an assistantship. I left my apartment in New York. My wife was not happy. She's from Brooklyn and we were not happy. She was not happy about leaving New York, but she was great. And we moved. And I was working towards the degree. In fact, Ed, you and I had been in touch quite a bit at the time because I was seeking your counsel on this stuff because I was thinking, gosh, do I just try to stretch this out or I just kind of bite the bullet and do the degree in a concise amount of time? And that's what I ended up doing because you got your doctor degree in City College, or not City, but yes, in New York City. So I ended up about 2 years into the degree and plus 2 summers on either side before and after. I mostly finished the degree, gained a lot of weight. I was just trying to just get through everything. It was just major stress. And then I got offered 2 positions, one in Macon, Georgia, and it was a pretty nice position, but it was a small school. And so then I had not heard from Western Kentucky University, so I contacted them and said, I had some applications out at this point. It was the spring of the second year I was there. By the way, I really doubled up on everything, just got it all done. It should be a 3 or 3.5 year degree. So I ended up contacting WKU, they call it Western Kentucky University, and they said, please come up. We want to actually audition you. So I flew up to Bowling Green, Kentucky and did the audition. It was clarinet and saxophone, the position. And so they offered me the job very, very shortly after the audition. And that's where we started here. In the meantime, though, I was still working at Radio City. Our contract had reduced the number of weeks we were working. So I was able to actually come back and play. It might be an Easter show and a Christmas show or just a Christmas show, but I was working enough where I could work around the teaching schedule and maybe leave on a Thursday night, catch a 6 o'clock flight or a 5:30 flight, go to New York, play all weekend, and then come back Sunday night and teach again Monday through Thursday. And I did this for years and years. And then sometimes fly in for a concert here and there. Once in a while, an artist would be at Radio City and they would hire the orchestra separately from the productions. At that point, though, I was also starting to kind of get involved with the Clarinet Association, the International Clarinet Association, just again, seeking out great players. I just wanted to hear what greatness sounded like and different styles. So I was becoming more involved with that group. And of course, being in academia, that's how academia sort of measures your progress, I guess. And I say, I guess, because sometimes at the root of it, it can be positive, but also there can be a sort of falseness to it as well, because at the end of the day, you have to practice and you have to play. And there's no getting around that. You can't document that on a piece of paper.
Well, yeah. And see, that's a key thing. I think everyone here might agree that we've all encountered those who have full professorships and are coasting or have stopped playing, have no relation to the music industry for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and have these students who are looking to have a career, and they're telling them stuff and they have no clue about what's going on in the industry today. There is that. There's no question it has existed. It exists. It will continue to exist. That's the nature. But all of you, the reason I wanted all of you, because you've all been active throughout your whole careers as players and as teachers. And that's the key, that the teacher be an active player involved and someone still searching, still striving to improve and to be a role model for their students. Just like we've talked about our heroes, all of you, in essence, are the heroes for your students because you are being active and being able to demonstrate and play, and they see you in that capacity. And I think that's such a vital thing. I mean, I've studied with so many teachers on sax, clarinet, flute, having lived in New York all my life. I couldn't get enough there, but everyone I studied with was a great player. There are people I did take some lessons with who I didn't continue because I didn't think they were committed as teachers, or, that wasn't their focus. But I never studied with someone who was just a teacher. They really were players who I admired. And so I think that carries forward to the university, that those who are going to teach people, especially instrumentalists, have to be active. Or have had active careers and can really speak from experience and are still engaged. What are your thoughts on that? You know, anyone?
Well, I completely agree, Ed, and I think in the beginning I was a little bit baffled, scratching my head, thinking, okay, how can you not be practicing? I mean, how can you not be getting nervous for an upcoming concert because you didn't think you prepared enough? So, but I guess I live in I guess you consider Bowling Green, Kentucky, the South or kind of the Midwest, a little bit between. Most people think of it as the South, but not the deep South. And a lot of my students want to become music teachers in a public school system. Very few have even an idea about what a playing career is, which is great. It's fine. It's completely fine. My goal is to help them link the idea of striving and continuing to be really excellent on your instrument. So by the time you graduate college, not only do you know your scales, but you have played recitals and you have an idea of different mouthpieces. Gary alluded to the equipment. You know, equipment is a huge part of the process of what we do. It can really change the way we conceptualize sound and the way we emit our air and the way we position our fingers. Everything, equipment is critical. So getting people to, I view myself as a link to that to help them be a bridge towards understanding that we're not striving to be just getting in front of students on a podium with a baton, but we're trying to be examples. Some of, actually, I could say I was in a band room a few years ago, one of my former students, and I didn't tell her to do this, but she's got a clarinet on one side and a trumpet on the other side on her podium. And every time there need be, the student needs to have a demonstration, she picks the horn up and she demonstrates for them. It's like a fluid thing. I guess the other thing that I wanted to interject, I don't know what, I'll say it now, maybe not directly, but as part of the teaching, is that I wanted to play my horns and play music, period. I wanted to that was my focus without any idea of a vocation. But the idea of teaching, I found, was that I had to kind of separate the soloist mentality from the ensemble sort of section player mentality. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that teaching the students to have experience playing chamber music and learning to blend their sounds and tune and direct their air. Joe Allard, of course, was the king of all of this, how to produce your sound and put your sound inside others as an ensemble player, is something that I continually work on with my students. And so in the teaching part, number one, I try to play with them constantly, not only with them, but as examples, but also with them. And number two, I want them to sort of have an equal part in all of this. I'm not one to kind of yell and scream, but I think the standards I have make them want to practice. And so I can't force them to get in a room and practice, but what I can do is try to be a good example for them so they want to practice. And so getting them to come into a lesson having worked on some things and maybe being a little frustrated, but then we go ahead and we pick it apart and pull it apart and help them progress a little bit each week. That's what I view my job is. So if they don't practice, I'm still going to work hard with them and we're going to work through problems and things. I think early on, what Greg was maybe talking about, when you get the experience of teaching and you learn on the job, you're all saying, I tried to make a syllabus with organized things and everything sequential, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't, it worked for these two students, but not for these three. And so my goal with students, I don't tell them directly this, but I kind of do, is I don't have a goal. I have a syllabus with sequences of things, but my goal is to teach them to get involved and engaged in what they do in that moment that we're doing. And that's real practice. What I do sometimes is we set a timer and I say, okay, it's 2 minutes. We only have a 2-minute lesson today. And we're going to get these two things worked on and let's see what we can do in 2 minutes. And we just focus. So again, inspiring them and engaging them. And at the end of the week, I've played, I don't know how many hours a day. I've played, sometimes 4 to 6, 7 hours in a day of teaching, because I'm just constantly trying to meet them where they are. Right. So,
and Gary, did you, when you were at TCU, did you also play at every lesson with your students and have your horns there to play with them?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, my horn stayed out on the pegs all day.
Yeah.
And I would have reeds all over the place, you know.
Not the ones you throw in the garbage.
Well, it got to be funny. It started out as a joke. We were, the student was struggling with reeds, so I fixed reeds for them, and I would tell them, show them in studio class what I'm doing. But I said, this isn't going to work today, and I think you know that. Can I go ahead and just put it on the door as an example? So I taped that reed on the door. When I retired, my door was full of clarinet and bass clarinet reeds. It was pretty funny. It got to be a joke. They would come in and said, I know this deserves to be on the door. And I said, allow me, but it got the point across that they learned to listen and be discriminating. And I would tell them, my goal would be for you to teach yourself when you leave. You got to be your own teacher when you leave, because I can't be there every hour that you walk across that stage and get your diploma. The learning doesn't stop then. You're just getting started. So,
well, that you see, that is something that I have found to be very frustrating in observing ex-students of mine and other generations, younger than myself, that so many feel once they've got their degree, or once that they've got their first gig, that's a good paying gig that they can live off of for a while, the idea of studying and continuing to grow in too many cases, unfortunately, seems to evaporate. They feel like, I've got it, I've made it. But I think John Coltrane's life is a great example to study of someone who never stopped searching and studying. I remember speaking with Jimmy Heath many years ago. He was as a guest at my university, and it was in my office when we were talking, and he knew Train as from Philadelphia, and Train played in his band, in one of Jimmy's early big bands. And he said, when I would go to Train's house, the rug would be filled with books: sociology, history, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, of course, music. He said he was into everything. It was constant. It was a constant endeavor for him to investigate all that life has to offer, as well as, of course, all music has to offer. So I think, that concept that somehow you've got your degree or you got your doctorate and now you've made it. Well, for some fields, maybe for plumbing, it works that way, and they get paid better than us anyway. Maybe as a car mechanic, maybe so. But in music, I just say to, these people, I say, well, really, have you ever heard Heifetz? Have you ever heard Bird? Really? You think they'd stop learning? I'm sorry. It's a mystery to me, but I think some of it has to do with how the people are being taught in the schools, that the teachers have that obligation. Greg, with your students, did you always play with them and refer to other players and other recordings for them to continually seek learning?
When it comes to I'm always going to recordings, because one of the main things that I do with my students is have them go through transcriptions, and so that's part of our weekly thing. As far as on my instrument, when I work with my students on the clarinet, I'm always on my clarinet. When I'm on the saxophone, not as much, because when I'm doing the clarinet, I'm more focused on the technical side of it. But when I'm teaching jazz saxophone, I tend to focus more on the jazz aspect of it. And so sometimes I'll play the saxophone, A lot of times I'll actually be playing the drums, and we'll be doing drum duets, and that's because I'm trying to train my students to not have to rely on having to hear the chord changes. I want them to be able to think theoretically, and so that's just part of how I teach, and uh, and I'm not downgrading the idea of using your ears. I'm just saying that a lot of times people use that as a crutch.
Right. Well, by playing drums, you're really getting them more attuned to the rhythmic aspect also. And
Exactly,
you
exactly.
know, one of my early interviews with Charles McPherson, it was very interesting for me having known Charles for a while, and he talked about how he warms up, and he warms up playing rhythms, where he'll just play a scale, let's say let's say an alto, an A harmonic, C harmonic concert, and just play through that in all different permutations and rhythms. You know, maybe setting the metronome at like 120, but just playing different musical phrases, different intervals, but always thinking rhythmically. And that's the way he thinks of when he warms up, rather than, let's say, playing through giant steps or a set of chord changes or licks sequentially. He thinks rhythmically, it was very revealing to me and very interesting. And I've tried to do more of that over the years. And I think so. That's very interesting that you would play drums with your students. And I think that really captures that aspect as well, it seems.
Yeah, but I will add that one of the things that I used to, when I took clarinet lessons, particularly when I'd be studying with Russell Dagan. Russell Dagan just had the most beautiful clarinet sound I ever heard. And I used to actually enjoy it sometimes when I would make mistakes because I knew he would pick up his, and I used to be so inspired by the way he played. So I'm just stressing the fact that he was a musician that was he was active in his craft. He was continuing to grow, and he didn't, and that inspired me to elevate what I was doing to a higher level. And so and so I'm just emphasizing the whole thing about how we have to continue in our craft and we have to continue to grow and let that inspire our students. And also just to let them know that when we talk about the industry, when we talk about being able to be a successful musician, that they know that we're not just blowing smoke, we're actually doing what they want to
It's so
do.
important. It's so
Yeah.
important to be that kind of role model, active. And yes, and both John and I studied with Joe Allett, who was no longer active when I started studying with him. He had to retire because of tremendous dental problems. But the thing was, he always played at the lessons. He would pick your horn up and play it. And
Yep.
I think, as Eddie Daniels also corroborated, when he'd pick your horn up, he'd get twice the amount of volume of sound that you would on your own setup. It was amazing, but it was always
True.
feeling. But the idea that your teacher can play and demonstrate is so, I think, essential and also inspiring. I know when I started flute with Tom Neifinger, I had already played flute a number of years, but you know, was now with a master, and I would get to my lesson a little early because I would wait outside the door so that I'd be there right on the hour. But I would listen to him, and he would always tend to end his lessons playing duets with the students, and he had the best students in New York. It was, and I would just listen to him. He'd always play the second part, so I'd hear the bottom, you know, the low notes, and I was just listening through the door. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And I looked forward to playing duets with my teachers. Several of them did that, but he particularly. And I think playing your horn, demonstrating, and even, you know, playing duets, whether they are written out or just sharing an improvisation, trading eights, you know, it's so inspiring. So what you mentioned when, you know, you would study with Russell Dragon, and you know, when you made a mistake, you'd look forward to him playing. It reminded me of an earlier interview I did this year with John Manassi, who began studying clarinet with David Weber. And from the very beginning, I mean, that was his teacher from the very first onset of him learning to play the clarinet, because he had played saxophone previously. And John said, you know, that's what kept him coming back, just hearing his teacher play and demonstrate for him. It's, you know, that is such an important part, because there's so many people who teach an instrument and do not play for their students. You know, maybe that can work as on a certain level for a very advanced player who's getting coaching on certain aspects. But players who are developing, and especially in college, you've got to play for your students. And the fact that you're playing with them and are active and are still searching, like John indicated, still striving, that does make an impression on those who are going to be impressionable.